Hey, John Gilroy here. Everyone thinks a federal contract depends on price and performance. Today, the impact of CMMC from being merely a recommendation to becoming a requirement. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, a podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. This is a special edition of the podcast. We are recording this at the offices of Fortrium in Lansdowne, Virginia. This is our third of 3 interviews, and this one will focus on overcoming challenges to becoming CMMC authorized. Our guests today are Brandon Reber, Senior Security Consultant, and Ben Scudera, Senior Director, Cyber Defense and Readiness. Both work at a company called Fortrium. Well, gentlemen, I guess it's not your father's CMMC, huh, Ben? Everything's changing. So, Brandon, 2 or 3 years ago, people would put their feet up on a table and go, CMMC, who cares about it? I'll do self-attestation. I'd like to have self-attestation in high school. Wouldn't that have been fun, Brandon?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They thought that was going to be the way of the world.
So, Brandon, take us up 40,000 feet and tell us about CMMC and where we're at today.
So 40,000 feet view of CMMC is once the 32 CFR rule was put into place in December, all federal contracts for the DoD will require a CMMC level 1, 2, or 3. And depending on the data that's within those contracts will dictate which level you need.
And the phrase that pays is require.
Absolutely.
And this is really for sure. Audits in the future for many people listening to this podcast? What do you think, Ben?
Absolutely. There's, tens of thousands of members of the DIB that are going to have to go through some level of audit. Some of it will be self-assessment, but for anybody who's doing that level 2, the part that requires a C3PAO, they're going to have some challenges because not just the requirements, but there's not that many C3PAOs out there yet, not that many certified assessors either. So there's a little bit of a waiting list for quite a few companies that are looking to figure out audits so they're ready to bid on work come December.
So, Brandon, here's a personal question for you. When you were a senior in high school and you had to turn in a history paper, did you wait to the night before and then write the paper and spend all night long proofreading it and turn it in the next morning? Or did you kind of methodically process it for the 6 weeks you had to do it? What was your experience and what are companies' experience with CMMC? Are they waiting till the last minute?
So actually, I've done both, and I can certainly tell you that it's easier to be prepared and not do it the night before. And certainly you have both in the DIB space. There are some companies who take it seriously and they are preparing themselves for CMMC and for the requirement rollout. And there are others that are hoping it's not real yet and they're going to overnight proofread.
Yeah. Well, Ben, let's go from 40,000 feet to outer space, maybe LEO orbit. Go up there with our buddy Elon and his friends. So CMC, basically what happened is the federal government said, well, look, a lot of these suppliers are insecure and they're feeding federal agencies, and so we have to have some kind of a standard. And so they come up with CMMC maybe 1 and CMMC 2. Now there's something called CMMC 3.0. Is this the current standard?
Not the current standard, but it is on the horizon. I think especially as we look at the current landscape of the federal government, they're pushing for updated cybersecurity expectations. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see CMMC 3.0 sooner than some might think. But right now it's 2.0, current version. That's what people are prepping for. It's still based off of the NIST 800-171 Rev 2. So it's still early days for a lot of companies, but the companies that are doing it right are starting to prepare now, starting to reach out to assessment organizations, trying to make sure they've got all their preparation in place, and they're doing that under the 2.0 standard.
And in previous versions, companies could self-attestate, is that right? And they would just give themselves a checklist and call up their contractor and go, yeah, we're all in compliance. This is nothing but trouble, so Brandon?
Absolutely. Some of the data was what they consider FCI, and that's level 1 self-attestation. And to move on to the CUI and the higher level data flow that you need to start to get to the level 2 and the level 3s.
So, Ben, when you go to buy a car, you take it to the mechanic and he inspects it and he said, yeah, this is acceptable. This is good enough. It's not going to blow up on you. It'd be pretty good. I would imagine that's what the CMC is all about, is they're going to a company like Brandon Software and the CMC certification would say, yes, he complies with these specific recommendations. And but Brandon may have suppliers that he uses as well. So this gets to be one of those Russian doll things, isn't it? Where you have a supplier, he has a supplier. So where do you draw the line with suppliers and the whole supply chain?
It's a good question. I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to the data. the whole purpose of CMMC is to protect the data generated through the DIB. So in some cases, we're really far down the stream where they're not actually having access to the data. There's not even a security consideration of their delivery as a vendor. They might be able to get away with self-attestation or even less. But as you go closer and closer to the data, especially if you're going to be processing or storing CUI or FCI, then that's where it becomes a real big challenge, because not only do they have to make sure they have their own security practices in place, but make sure that their partners have evaluated how they interact with them as a company and how they interact with federal data.
So, Brandon, I have my decoder ring here, and COI is controlled unclassified information, so we know what COI is. And what I see in different organizations is that, let's say John Gilroy Software, I look at my environment and I go, well, I'm going to figure out exactly what the boundary is for CUI. And then all of a sudden, when I get audited, it turns out that maybe I didn't scope it correctly. And so it may be a much more subtle thing that maybe an outsider could look and go, hey, my name is Ben. We've done this with 10 organizations, and you're not scoping this correctly. This actually is CUI. When you make just the definitions get difficult, don't they?
Absolutely. And that's a very good point with CMMC. Scoping so often is the most important thing you can do. And you follow the data, as Ben described, to get your scope to a good spot. Sometimes you're a little too close on the inside, and having the external eyes to look at your boundary and to give it a third-party look to see where the data is actually flowing is a good thing.
Because a lot of times you're working on something and you're blind to your own mistakes. When I was in high school, I was once working in a car. I took out a water pump. It had 5 bolts. I put it back in. I couldn't find the 5th bolt. A friend across the street walked over and said, it's right in front of you. It's right there. So sometimes to do a thorough gap analysis, you need another set of eyes. Right, Ben?
I would say so. I think a really interesting piece of this is some of the differences between CMMC and some of the traditional public sector frameworks. So FISMA, FedRAMP, there's very many similarities where FISMA and FedRAMP are built off NIST 853. CMMC is on 171. Many of the controls are the same, but the scope is different. In many cases, it's different. And what you'll find is there are folks that feel like they've got their public sector story fleshed out. They know what they're, especially in the cloud space right now, they know that they've got a system, a production system. They've got a red box around it on a diagram, and they feel really good that that's their scope. And then what you find is that the CMMC scope isn't that clean, and that it filters into other portions of the organization. And again, it's driving a lot deeper into the supply chain as well. And so you need to have either in-house expertise, which at this stage is rather challenging because there's not that many folks that know CMMC yet, or find somebody who is an expert and bring them in and have them help validate.
So, Brandon, here's a scenario. So I've got John Gilroy Software here. I got 10 employees, and I'm trying to get my CMMC certification. Great. Okay. So I'm going to pull someone off a job who is bringing in money, and I'm going to reduce my company's income. It seems like this is a no-win proposition for someone to complete the CMMC on their own.
It's certainly not an easy lift, for sure. And a lot of it is due to the fact that you are doing a pre-award. So you don't even have the assurance of the government contract yet to do this work and to be compliant. So you certainly have some financial ramifications for CMMC without having the assurance of actually winning the award.
It's always difficult to make approximations of how many companies are looking at this. But Ben, I'm sure you can figure it out. I think you called it earlier. We talked about organizations seeking assessment. So how many organizations are out there that are considering this assessment? So
the estimates from DoD in 2022 were that there were 80,000 OSAs that would need level 2, but that's not counting the people who bid and lose. So that estimate was upwards of 360,000. And what's really interesting is, as I just mentioned, there's relatively few folks that have the right expertise, and there's even fewer folks that have the right level of certification to actually do these sorts of assessments, inclusive of the personnel within a C3PAO.
So we have 80,000 companies that are interested and only around 70 C3PAOs. mean, that's like trying to get a ticket to a football game and there's 80,000 people who want one of those 70 seats. Not going to work, is it? Brand is not going to work.
It's not going to work. And the fun part about it is not only do you have 80,000 people, every 3 years they have to go through it again. So you have to continually rotate the door on top of the 80,000 number that's there.
Okay, so Ben, let's get out the checklist here. We'll get a whiteboard going. Hard to scope environment, especially CUI. There are going to be documentation gaps, and individuals may think they have all the documentation, and when they go to get audited, they find out that they don't. But you can be overconfident with a lot of these. It's changing quickly. So what's the answer? How can people who are considering, when people know us, what's the way out?
So there's a few options. Many organizations, especially the very small organizations, simply are trying to do it themselves. They might have a single IT guy on staff, and they've been tasked with the duty of determining where that data sits. The reality is, whether they take it in-house or they hire an outside consultant, it all comes down to starting with the data. Once you've determined which systems are in scope based on which data is flowing through your system, then you can start talking about NIST controls, going through the 110 controls of the NIST 171 Rev 2, as well as starting to consider how that might play with downstream vendors as well as your clients themselves. Not everybody is selling an all-in-one solution. They might take just a few controls off of their client's list, and they want to be able to describe that in a customer responsibility matrix. So they take some time to actually detail that information. But putting together that package, again, it's not an easy lift. It's not a small effort. And so the reality is, all of this has to backtrack from when you think your company is going to need whichever level of CMMC that they're going to need. So if they want to bid contracts in December, you have to start building a project plan backwards. And at the time of this recording, that's not much time left already.
No, it's down the road. I always have a debate with my wife about defining different things, and I'm sure there's defined problems in CMMC like vulnerability scanning. Now, Ben may have one definition, John may have one definition, Brandon may have one definition, and they all may be, debatable, and I can hold my own against you too. But an auditor comes in, they have a different definition of vulnerability scanning. And so it's almost impossible without having a third party come in and say, we've done this 20 times before. This is how we define vulnerability scanning. And how many variations on that alone can there be? Brandon, tons, huh?
Certainly is tons. And a lot of the 110 controls dive deeper into than 320 objectives, right? Oh. And it's good for folks who are going through this process to make sure that they're reading the CMMC assessment guide, the 171, NIST 171 Alpha, and those certain guides will walk you down the path of what those requirements mean and intend to mean. There's good examples in each of those documents to provide clarity for companies who are going through the process so they understand what auditors may be looking for.
What about the business process here, Ben? What if your chief technology officer is really excited about doing all the details for CMMC, and your board of directors or your CEO is, maybe not as enthusiastic about it? And so where do you fit in this picture, Ben?
Well, we've seen both sides of that coin. We've had companies who want to do the bare minimum. Maybe companies who have been self-attesting in the past and think that they can keep getting away with it, especially, at the leadership levels. But we also have seen the other side of it, where we've had organizations that say they're going to CMMC everything. They want their whole company, everything, not just the places that, we've been discussing that might touch the data, but all their offices and people, which has other implications. So on either side of it is really an educational thing. I mean, the reality is there's the business impact of not being able to bid on the work that they want to bid. There's a lot of additional focus lately, and I would even say in the last 5 months, for those that are in the know, Katie Arrington rejoining the DoD, she was a big proponent of CMMC. Many people see that as an indicator that CMMC is full steam ahead, right? And that not complying to CMMC either means you can't bid or means that you might get called out for essentially fraud that you would have committed to have met a requirement and you didn't, and you knew that you didn't.
Well, that's a lawyer word, man. I don't want to deal with any fraud with anyone.
So, well, a lot of it then is communicating to that leadership, right? So we do, when we do a CMMC workshop, which is really the earliest stage of an engagement that we could do, we're giving training, teaching them how to do the boundary scoping, helping them through that effort. We are evaluating their current state versus their future state, but we're also doing an executive debrief. And a lot of that is driven through the stakeholders within the company who do have the closest touch to the CMMC requirements. So that might be a GRC professional or a lead that's involved with the bid process for these contracts, and making sure that there's a shared message that's then presented to the other stakeholders who might need to have a budgetary consideration, might need to have their teams participate in implementation, or just might need some level of executive buy-in. And we try and present that message in a way that they understand it.
Brandon, I try to read books and keep up with technology. I recently read Chip Wars by Brian Miller, and I learned a lot about the whole development of Taiwan and the chips and how they integrate with lithography companies in Europe and designers in California. It's a very long supply chain, and there's a lot of dependencies. So let's focus on CMMC. I would imagine there's third-party dependencies as well for all these companies. So if you go into a workshop, Ben, and you may discover that there's 5 companies that are supplying this company for information. Now, so is this like a chain where you have to go back to each individual one, or where do you draw the line on CMMC compliance?
So absolutely. And the higher you go up on the chain of CMMC levels, 2 and 3, particularly 3, it reaches down to your supply chain all the way to the bottom. Oh. And you have to reach in there from logistical standpoints to scanning and monitoring the data. And it goes all the way from the top big organizations to the mom and pop shops who may have a role to play in the development of any kind of CUI product for the government.
Yeah. So Ben, frequently in my podcast, I quote Tom Cruise and show me the money, but this time I'm going to ask you the question, show me the timeline. Okay. Brandon mentioned a timeline of late September here. So give me a timeline for a company, and what's a rough amount of time for, we can pick a $200 million company or something like that, or a $100 million company. What's a rough timeline that people should consider for the CMMC process?
Well, just the point of getting up to being ready for audit, I would say 4 to 6 months. Mm-hmm. So the reality is you have to do those early evaluations. That might take a month and a half. That might include a workshop, a gap assessment, whether that's driven internally or through a third party. From that, you're going to have outcomes from both an internal, I would say, implementation side, where you have to evaluate your technologies, configuration, processes, as we've been talking about, potentially some of your downstream vendors. And in parallel to that, you very likely have to prepare documentation. And the reality is that very few organizations are going to have sufficient policies and plans for CMMC without that they haven't started yet, right? No. So after those efforts, you're usually at the 4 to 6 month mark from when you started. And again, it's really going to depend on the company itself, but that's I would say an average we've been seeing. That also puts us in a place where, as I mentioned, that doesn't really leave much wiggle room if you're looking to be ready to bid on contracts in December of 2025 here. So that's definitely a challenging piece. We've also mentioned the audit timeline, where there are relatively few C3PAOs, as well as a bottleneck on the assessors themselves. So the challenge there being that if you're not ready and you don't understand your scope well enough to schedule an audit, you might find yourself at the back of a relatively long line where you can't quite get through yet. And that can extend those timelines even further. A lot of it also then would come around to your original quote around show me the money, which is there's a lot of cost and time to get an assessor through, and that cost and time is then passed along to the vendors, because there's a supply and demand issue there.
Many times with human beings, when they look at a specific number of controls from NIST, they'll list the controls and they'll be sucked into this checkbox thing. Well, but really, Brandon, this is more of a maturity. See, is a maturity model, right? I mean, let's pull the words out. We put the maturity in CMMC. I mean, this is almost like it's not a quick fix. It's maybe an alteration of a company's risk profile completely. So it almost needs buy-in from the CEO and the board. It just can't be a CTO's objective, can it?
No, it can't. It certainly needs to be the culture, and it needs to be something that the company does from the top down. And to your point, for maturity model, right? It's a crawl, walk, run, certainly phased approach. And each of the requirements build on themselves as you go through. 320 may seem very small compared to a 53 where there's over 700, but very, very quickly they will compound on each other, and you go from the crawl, walk, run quickly.
When I was in college, I used to golf. I got real frustrated and swore off the golf links for the rest of my life. I got real mad with it. There may be companies, Ben, who dive into CMMC and throw up their hands and go, nah, this is just, have you seen that happen?
We have. I mean, I not necessarily that the company has given up entirely, but that they are at a place where their current business and the expected spend, really the investment, doesn't justify their potential return at this time. And so they're essentially deciding, do we do nothing? Do we find a way to re-architect to essentially have like a very small enclave that allows us to support this contract without as much of an expenditure? But there's definitely companies that have basically said, well, let's see how things shape up throughout the rest of the year and come back to it. The reality is there were a few false starts with CMMC over the last few years, right? And so there are companies that are banking on that again. As I mentioned earlier, though, the indicators are there that this time it's real.
So, Brandon, I got a strategy question for you here. So put on your strategy hat. So we got John Gilroy Software, and I'm frustrated. I'm sick of it, And so what many companies have done is they've come up with John Gilroy Federal Solutions, and they'll have a separate company, and this separate company will gain the CMMC certification. Is that a strategy that companies have used? This whole sub-company thing?
Oh, absolutely. And what they end up doing then, to Ben's point, is carving out a small portion of their business, and they called it their CMMC
enclaving is what you called it. Oh, I see. That's what enclaving is.
Absolutely. And then what they'll do is then they'll put a boundary around this small subsection of their work.
Right.
And that's where the CUI, FCI data will live as they process through the government contracts that they work on.
So popular strategy, Ben, or is that wrought with problems?
It's a very popular strategy, actually. So one of the things we've discussed is those downstream vendors. Many of the large cloud providers out there are going to have different tiers of their own licensing. They'll have a regulated environment, which is FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high, and they'll have a commercial environment and maybe many others in between. What you'll find is most small businesses are entirely located in the least expensive license, which would be the commercial license, and therefore not in the regulated environment. And so even just the sense of carving out 10 licenses in the FedRAMP high version of that cloud and saying that CUI or FCI are only going to be in that smaller enclave is going to be an approach to at least limit the rest of the company, whether it be a full split of the company or not. And then the other, say, 20 or 1,000 employees stay on the commercial, but are by policy limited that they're not going to support those contracts or not going to interact with that data. So that is a strategy we've seen.
So Brandon, I've done interviews with big companies like Microsoft and individual authors and every size. And there is an argument that's made that says, well, CMMC is easy for the big companies, but kind of smaller on the little companies. And so this is a bias against the smaller providers. So the big dogs out there, and we all know their names, they have teams on staff. They can comply with CMMC and they can do it easily. But the smaller companies that are maybe a supplier behind the eight ball on this. So what do you think? Is it easy for big companies, too difficult for small companies? Or here's a phrase. This is a technical phrase. The juice is not worth the squeeze. It's for a small company. It's not worth it.
I think sometimes the nice thing about CMMC and the NIST 800-171, it allows for the controls to be met in creative different ways. So it certainly can be easier for the big companies that have big pockets to throw money at it, and they can take care of it much, much quicker. But there are certainly ways for smaller companies to get CMMC compliant, and sometimes reaching out and working with an RP or a C3PO to help you in an advisory standpoint can open up the thinking outside the box to get you compliant with these controls in a different sort of way instead of just throwing money at the problem.
So, Ben, you mentioned Katie Arrington, and 4 or 5 years ago, she was everywhere. You walk into 7-Eleven and she'd be on a cup in there or something. And she was everywhere, you know. You go here, you go there. She's everywhere. And then she kind of disappeared for a while. And now she's back in the forefront. She's speaking at Waldorf Astoria here in July. So my question to you is, so you sit back and wait 4 years and it's going to change again and CMC is not going to be a priority? Or so what's your prediction for CMC after the next presidential election?
So it's a good question. I mean, we've got a few years yet where I think that it's really getting solidified. The reality is, over the last few years, it continued to progress, and a lot of the announcements were actually late 2024, right? So before any sort of administration change. So I still do expect it to continue moving forward. There are other initiatives that the DoD is pushing forward at the same time, which are at least closely related. So it'll be interesting to see how those all kind of evolve in parallel. The DoD has pushed through the SWIFT program, which is software fast track, that has some similar expectations for their vendors, but maybe a different lens. And then there's also talks about the RMF itself and how that might play into the grand scheme of things over the next few years, which also would therefore impact some of the other DoD expectations around like IL2 or IL4 or 5.
So Brandon, kind of a forward-looking question for you. Do you think it's going to vary in the next 4 or 5 years? Is this subject to presidential administration, or do you agree with Ben when he says, no, really, this is independent of any political administration? This is just a solid way to protect the DoD.
I certainly agree with Ben in that vein. It's certainly not dependent on what administration's in the White House. I think both sides of the aisle want to make sure that our DoD and infrastructure is secure and safe, and that the data is not stolen by any foreign adversaries, right? And CMMC outside the classified space addresses that exact problem. So I see it moving forward. It's certainly being rolled out in phases. To the point we spoke about a little earlier, we're still on CMMC level 2. I think in the future, we'll see CMMC level 3 with the 800.171 NIST Rev 3, which kind of combines some controls and gets rid of outdated things as we move forward.
And it's constantly changing anyway, that's for sure. I haven't asked the AI question. I'll hold that for the next interview on CMMC. If you would like more information, FORTREUM, fortrium.com/CMMC-800-171 for more information. And call up, get a hold of Ben. And there's I think there's worksheets you have available. People can look and maybe see where they stand as far as the compliance goes for CMMC. Is that what Fortrium can provide?
Yep, that's right. And so if anyone reaches out to us, we'd be happy to help walk them through what steps they should be taking.
Yeah, at least they can get a rough idea of where they stand and see what happens in the future. But there's a lot going on here. And earlier in the interview, you said that regular commercial organizations are understanding some of their vulnerability, and they may be actually looking at CMMC and have nothing to do with federal contracting at all, but just it's a practical set of controls, huh? Yeah.
So it really depends on what they're moving forward with, but I think traditionally in the U.S. especially, people are looking at NIST 800, 171, and 853 as just strong control sets that they're able to use across the board. Again, it is a place where you can define some parameters and get some good guidance where you might not quite know what you should set your organization against, and both those frameworks have the ability to set a level of expectation and hold your organization accountable for it.
Oh, all kinds of great information on CMMC. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guests, Brandon Reber, Senior Security Consultant, and Ben Scudera, Senior Director, Cyber Defense and Readiness at a company called Fortrium.